maybe we can begin with how you came to work in the field of plant medicine.
Okay, well, I guess like many of us, my interests really come from firsthand experience. In one line, I tried sacred plants, and I feel really real blessings and learning and awe and gratitude, and that sort of sparkled my curiosity. And it was a natural process since I like to read and I'm an anthropologist. And then, I get curious, started to read, started to research and talk to people. Next thing, I'm organizing a conference. So it was very organic since the whole beginning.
Right. And was it with ayahuasca? Is that the main medicine you worked with?
No, I when I was 20 years old, I did a big road trip backpacking around. I spent 1.5 years traveling. I was in Guatemala, Mexico, went all the way from Guatemala to Alaska by land, and then back to New York and to the Brazilian coast, did this big road trip, this big adventure, and sort of fell in love with Mexico. That for me as a Brazilian, we're really not taught to look too much to Latin America, but more towards Europe and the United States. So it was a big discovery for me to learn about Mexico. And when I was in Mexico, I visited Huautla de Jimenez, where I tried psilocybin mushrooms. It was truly epic. And I also had the chance to eat peyote in the desert in the region of San Luis Potosí, Viricuta, and Real de Catorce, and also tried LSD. So I had that whole array of things. They were really beautiful experiences. I was also visiting the ruins and dreaming about other worlds and other utopias and other societies and other times and other ways to be in the world. And everything seemed so part of this other larger reality, and looking at revisiting the way I have understood everything and us being part of nature and the universe. It was really powerful and life-changing for me, that whole entire 1.5 years. Also traveling a lot in indigenous communities, just hanging out, basically. The creative time of doing nothing, the most creative and powerful thing we can do, nothing, just live. And so that, together with being young and so idealist and wanting to make a revolution, and that kind of purity that, your early 20s, you have this sort of open heart and just feeling everything was magical. I think it was also kind of safer to travel. It was already dangerous back then, but not as dangerous as now. And after that, I stayed 5 years without doing anything, just kind of really digesting that whole experience. And when I was 26, I encountered ayahuasca in Brazil.
Right. And was that through the Unio de Vegetal, the Ayahuasca Church?
Yeah, that was where I tried first. But then I went to Santo Daime, which is the other big Brazilian ayahuasca religion. And next thing, I traveled to Colombia and to Peru and tried ayahuasca among indigenous groups and mestizo settings, vegetalista. And then started this whole chapter, which has been a great part of my professional and spiritual, personal trajectory since then.
Right. I'm really interested in what the situation is like in Brazil with these ayahuasca churches. Are they kind of, I mean, 'cause it's completely legal, right? Ayahuasca, are they just very accessible and widely known?
Well, that's kind of a relative thing to say, right? Like, they are very widely known in the circles that I hang out with, but I guess I am a little bit biased. I don't really know a lot of people that have zero relationships to any of this. But yeah, it's still like, if you think in terms of numbers, numerically, it's very minor. 0.001 something percent. But Brazil is a huge nation too. So even a very small percentage is a population of maybe 30, 40, 50,000 people. So there is a whole culture around ayahuasca in Brazil. There's lots of things. There's a huge musical culture, different people receiving different kinds of hymns or sacred songs, or different rituals. Have the main churches, ayahuasca, the religions are Santo Daime, UDV, and Barquinha. And then you have also what I have called neo-ayahuasqueros, which is a kind of splinter, dissident, transformation, morphing of those traditions as they arrive in big cities like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Brasília. They combined with multiple different social and cultural contexts, like all kinds of urban religiosities or yoga or therapies, Hinduist spirituality, arts, and created different kinds of combinations. So there is that whole culture. And since more or less like maybe mid 2000s, indigenous peoples started to go out from the Amazon and travel and offer rituals, have ceremonies in these big cities. And so people can also attend firsthand rituals with indigenous leaders. And so there is a big conversation every weekend. There's dozens of rituals and people go in different things. Some people are members of the churches, others founded their own lineage. And there's a big circulation of substances, objects, ritual songs, knowledge in these networks, these urban networks. And as an academic writer and researcher of the topic, I have been promoting knowledge and research around it. There's also this other universe, which is the universe of the researchers of those things. And we also, that's a very rich universe. We normally gather in the Brazilian Anthropological Association biannual meetings, ABA, and we have working groups to talk about the substances. So like 20 years ago, the working groups were like 3-4 people. Today, we have 2 big working groups with like 20, 30 new research per year. And sometimes we reject papers and people because there's just too much. And so that's another thing. Or our recent book on sacred plants in the Americas that I did co-edited with my colleague Goulart. We launched it and we sold 1,000 copies just like that. Boom. This book was in 2019. My previous book on sacred plants was in 2004. So from 2004 to 2019, 15 years, or sorry, I'm confusing the dates. Perhaps it was 10 years. I can't remember. But anyway, it's grown. It's grown a lot. And the same thing exists in Mexico, where there is a huge network of people that attend TPs, different ayahuasca churches, hybrid peyote circuits, and so forth.
Right. And when was it that the ayahuasca churches emerged in Brazil? I have very little knowledge of how that process happened.
The first ayahuasca church is the Santo Daime by Mestre Irineu, so it's around the 30s. And then you have Barquinha and União do Vegetal around the 50s and 60s. And maybe they expanded to urban cities from the north, from the Amazon to the cities around late 70s, beginning of 80s. And then they expanded abroad, maybe in the 90s. And today you have Santo Daime and União do Vegetal all over the world, including here in the Bay Area where I'm currently living.
Right. And I think I first heard about them through America and, their being able to give ayahuasca in certain states as a kind of religious freedom protection. But yeah, so I guess in my mind, I wasn't sure if it was something that was a response to the drug war Or, but it sounds like this is a true piece of Brazilian culture that's been there since before the war on drugs began.
Yeah, this is definitely a true Brazilian phenomena. It combines, on the one side, of course, Amerindian shamanism. So this whole idea that the plants are spirits, that they have some kind of agency, and they can teach you, communicate with you if you follow their diets and if you follow the teachings of these religions. So it's based on Amerindian shamanism. It also has some European esoterical influences from esoterical trends from 19th century in Europe, Spiritism and Catholicism, of course. Both of these churches are Christian. And also it combines elements of African religious elements. So Candomblé, Umbanda, which are very typical Brazilian adaptations of African religiosity, are also part of the base that forms these religions. And so these religions emerged in Brazil. They don't come as a product of counterculture or some kind of contemporary intellectual leftist artistic appreciation for drugs, but they are considered sacraments that were like riverine mestizo caboclo adaptations of indigenous practices, mixing with other forms of cultural and religious expressions from the Amazon, from the Northeast. And so they predate this. Of course, that when it arrives to the big cities, it calls a lot the attention of more upper middle class people and people with interest in drugs or in intellectuals or researchers, people from universities or artists, not the same rubber tappers and traditional riverine Amazon people. So it gets mixed in the big cities, joined by middle-class liberal professionals and students and academics like myself. And then it gets mixed. And so it's very rich and unique phenomena, and it has been exported. And this is also super interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask what your thoughts are on the kind of the global this global phenomenon of ayahuasca churches. Is it largely a positive thing in your eyes?
Yeah, well, whether it's positive or not, it's kind of we can sit and comment, while having a nice cappuccino. But this is happening, and it's kind of, I see more as my mission to try to understand and to analyze. On the one side, as this is my researcher hat, my anthropology Ph.D. hat, and my executive director, nonprofit leader and organizer, I see as part of our mission to promote harm reduction towards this expansion. So I don't really think whether, this is good or bad, but how can I understand it, and how can I help gear this in ways that are positive? But yeah, a lot of colleagues are pretty orthodox and sort of against, critical and more purist. I am not among those people. I have benefited myself from drinking ayahuasca a lot, and I have deep respect for this beverage and these traditions and the peoples from where it originates, the lands from where it originates. And I think that there is a lot of real sincere religious interests. And I am personally quite amazed with foreigners that get interested in this aspect of Brazilian culture. And a lot of people learn the languages. They study Portuguese, they sing in Portuguese, they read the teachings in Portuguese. And so I think it's interesting. Brazil is exporting, we were colonized, and Christianity was put and established upon us. And now it's time to export our Amerindian Catholicized version of ayahuasca back to Europe and the United States, and sort of promote this inverse colonization. There's multiple aspects to it. I published a bunch of books and did a lot of research, so it's kind of hard to even know where to take it. But yeah, I think it's fascinating as a cultural phenomena, and how this combines with, it has this kind of core that is the traditions, and then it combines with local elements. And so it combines indefinitely and creatively with different things that happen in different areas. So I particularly have a lot of respect for foreigners that are trying to learn these traditions, and that trying to learn different culture, different language, and can coordinate, drinking this powerful beverage, and also maybe singing or meditating, concentrating, keeping it together during the experience. There's a whole protocol on how to behave in these rituals. Of course, there can be excesses or abuses, but in general, I see this with positive eyes, and I am eternally fascinated by seeing the multiple developments of what's going on.
Right. And do you see your role as an anthropologist as kind of documenting and trying to kind of understand those multiple cultural kind of things that are unfolding?
Yes, I have a lot of my research has been, so my master's was on what I call this neo-ayahuasqueros, the new uses of ayahuasca in urban centers in Brazil. Of course, this term can be put in brackets because the ayahuasca churches are new themselves, but I'm thinking of like the ayahuasca churches as this kind of mattress of the religious use in Brazil, independent of the more traditional and long-standing history of indigenous use. And this arrived in the big cities and combined into these multiple versions of religiosity. So that was my master's. And my Ph.D., it was called Ayahuasca Mamancuna Merci Beaucoup, about the internationalization and diversification of the Peruvian ayahuasca vegetalism. So that is about this phenomena of North Americans or Canadians, Europeans, Australians going to South America to drink ayahuasca on the one hand, and on the other hand, this phenomena of the itinerant shamans that go from South America to the so-called developed world and offer circles and sometimes travel from city to city. And this other universe that is this mixture of interest of science and activism, which is the field of psychedelic science, that mix a lot of research, scientific interest with personal interest, and people that are have a kind of relationship to this practices. Because a lot of people that are interested in drinking ayahuasca or things like that, they don't have often institutional spaces where they can share that interest. Like, if you're interested in gardening, you're going to go to the gardeners club or whatever. Where do you go if you're interested in ayahuasca? So a lot of this interest, the psychedelic conferences, the circuit of conferences, and this kind of psychedelic community, global virtual community, has worked as a sponge to receive a lot of the interest that exists in the community. And I in my PhD, I looked at this also as another setting, let's say, of this expansion. So you have the expansions of the circuits of people giving ayahuasca, both in Peru and abroad, but you also have the circuit of psychedelic science and this mix where, people sometimes during the day present a lecture and then at night participate in a ritual. And you also have indigenous people joining the circuit. sometimes as authors, as presenters or organizers, organizing a conference in Peru so people could go to this conference and also take this medicines. And then the scientific categories that we use to explain things start to migrate to the discourse of the people that practice those things. So both the people who offer and the people who offer the experiences or participate in them start to describe these experiences in terms of DMT or integration, or using terms that are exogenous to the traditional contexts. So it gets to be this mix where science and psychology also influence the narrative of shamans or religious leaders, religious practitioners. So my PhD was about that.
That's really interesting. And now a lot of your work is done through the Chacruna Institute, right? Can you tell people about what that is and the work you do there?
Yeah, so I am the executive director of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. I also work in the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, where I'm public education and cultural specialist. So it's two different angles to my life that I find kind of complementary, and I sort of find the Chacruna Institute a sister organization to MAPS and vice versa. So in my Chacruna hat, I am the executive director. It's kind of my dream, and we have a team of people supporting. The Chacruna is named, of course, for those of you who don't know, it's a catch-all word for Psychotria viridis, which is the leaf of this bush that is also used to make ayahuasca. So it's a tribute to ayahuasca, to my love for ayahuasca, to the inspiration ayahuasca has been in my life. Ayahuasca, this great friend and ally and plant teacher. And so the Chacruna Institute is a very modest grassroots nonprofit, struggling to survive in the expensive waters of the Bay Area and all the million new investors and startups and, business people that are interested in the field of psychedelics these days. But yeah, we basically promote public education around psychedelic plant medicines. And then we try to create this bridge between the world of shamanism, indigenous people, ritual, ceremony, religion, and the field of psychedelic assisted therapy or psychedelic science. And on top of it, we are really focused on creating access, inclusion, diversity in the field of psychedelic science. So we try to give visibility to the voices that normally stay out of the conversation. So what are those voices? Indigenous people, Black people, people of color in general, women, queer people, people from the global South, the disciplines of humanities, so anthropology, political science, sociology, geography, history. We're trying to rewrite the narratives that the field of psychedelic science tells itself. It's like, I like to think that when we go to do therapy, we're trying to rewrite the story that we tell us about ourselves. So I think the Chacruna Institute is trying to do some kind of cultural therapy where we rewrite, the stories that we tell about the psychedelic field to itself. So both internally to the psychedelic field, in terms of giving visibility to these voices that often are silenced or invisible, but also to the society at large, because we're really trying to promote the cultural legitimacy of these plants, traditions, and the people who brought them to us, and their lands and their culture and rights and everything. Because what happens is that a lot of people can try to, combat the drug war and all the evils associated to it, and that's legitimate and important, and we also do that. But it's beyond that. I mean, what the essence of the problem that exists around psychedelics is a moral problem, is a cultural problem. It's a cultural war. It's a war based on religious dogma, on moral views, puritanical views, that don't consider these substances legitimate and consider them either pathological or criminal or perversions or artificial or illusions. And so at the core of the drug war, there is a religious, moral, cultural problem. And that is something that we need to address. That is much harder to change than the concrete, let's say, consequences of the drug war. So it's a lot of people are focused on combating, like incarceration or the problem of drug adulteration, or the problem of how the drug war has justified ethnic wars or geographic occupation of other countries, and talk about financial issues or the drug cartels and all of that. But to talk about why we don't consider psychedelics or drugs as legitimate things, that's harder. And so we are working on this sphere of culture, of knowledge, of awareness, of education.